is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He's on the faculty at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And of course, he's an opinion columnist for the New York Times. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Great to be on.
So let's talk about this tax bill that seems to be rocketing its way toward enactment in Washington. We got an analysis this week from the Treasury Department, this one-page sheet that claims that Trump's economic policies, including this tax plan, should increase economic growth so much that, in fact, budget deficits will shrink despite the large size of this tax cut. Is this a plausible analysis?
So this is analysis with scare quotes, because the number comes out of thin air. They just made up, they said we're going to increase growth by 0.7 of a percentage point, which doesn't sound like that much.
Each year.
So over 10 years, that GDP is going to be 7% larger. They gave no explanation of where that comes from. So they just told the Treasury staff to assume that growth rate and then tell us what it does for the budget deficit. And look, it's first of all, that's about 9 times as big as what the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is Congress's official evaluator, says we're going to get out of these tax bills. And it's just it's a crazy number. Mm-hmm. Advanced economies like the United States, at the technological frontier, with non-completely crazy economic policies, there's almost nothing the government could do. The most ideal policy in the world is not going to boost GDP by 7%. So this is crazy.
So there's been a variety of different analyses that have come out. You've talked about this joint committee number that found this modest but positive effect on economic growth. Right. There was also an analysis from the Tax Policy Center, which is it's a joint project of 2 sort of left-of-center think tanks in Washington. Their analysis also finds a very modest positive effect on the economy. Do you think this is right? Do you think this tax plan will be growth positive compared to doing nothing at all?
There's 2 questions here. One is, we really are not, none of these studies are very good at dealing with the impact of what does the deficit actually itself do to growth. And I've sort of famously been deficit were not a problem during the period of a depressed economy. Now that we're close to full employment, there may be some negative. But there's a subtler issue, which I don't think any of these organizations, even the Tax Policy Center, are great people, but I don't think they've gotten a complete handle on, which is growth in what exactly? Because what they find is that gross domestic product, which is what we usually talk about, it will be bigger, but we're also going to, the way that happens is by increased inflows of foreign capital. That means that we have a bigger capital stock, which means that we produce more, but it also means that we pay more profits to foreign companies. So, also, actually about 1/3, we think, of the corporate tax cut benefit to corporate after-tax profits will actually go to foreigners. So if we ask what happens to gross national income, the actual income of U.S. residents, it's not at all clear that goes up at all.
Oh, so that's interesting. So usually, people talk about GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is total activity economic activity within the United States. Yeah. You're saying that the gross national product number, which is the total economic activity that accrues to people in the United States, so including U.S. profits from foreign activities, but excluding profits to foreign owners from U.S. activities. You're saying that could be negative even if GDP was positive?
Yeah, it's never been an important issue in the United States until now, because the difference between GDP and GNP is trivial. Mm-hmm. But economies that are smaller, that have lots of foreign investment, can be a really big deal. Ireland, GNP is only 75% of GDP. Because there's so much foreign ownership. Now, and this bill, even if it does what it's supposed to, it kind of moves us towards being more like Ireland, which means that we could see a headline GDP number that is up some, but that's all or almost all offset by these increased payments to foreigners.
So one of the key arguments that Republicans have been making for this bill is that when you cut corporate taxes, you get big benefits to workers, not just through economic growth, but because they contend that a substantial fraction of the corporate tax is actually paid by workers, in effect, because companies that prefer to locate in places with lower corporate tax rates, they'll be willing to pay higher wages when they're operating in a place that has a lower corporate tax rate. And even that Tax Policy Center analysis that we were discussing, a somewhat left-of-center organization, they assume that about 20% of the corporate tax is ultimately borne by wages. Is this right? Is there a significant benefit to workers from a reduction of the corporate tax?
Probably some, a little bit. And it matters a lot what horizon we're talking about. In the short run, nothing. All of this effect only works through capital coming in and building up and increasing the demand for labor. So that takes time. So if you ask what happens in the first year from a corporate tax cut, none of it goes to workers. Over the course of 10 years, maybe a larger portion, but there are limits in how far this goes. So yeah, there's something there. You know, realistically, we have to imagine there'll be some effect, but you know, will it be visible? Will workers see their wages increase in a way that anyone will notice over the next 5 years? No.
So if the effects are small, does that mean that sort of some of the doom and gloom about this bill from Democrats has been excessive? I mean, let's say it's going to add a few percentage points to public debt as a percentage of the economy 10 years from now. Interest rates are very low. It doesn't look to me like that there are likely to be significant crowd out effects from that. Are there significant downside risks from this bill? Is this going to hurt us, or does it just not matter very much?
I think it probably doesn't matter very much. I mean, if you actually, I mean, it's not a good thing. You're supposed to use times when you're near full employment to pay down debt, not run up additional debt. And you know, running up additional debt, with most of it going to a very small number of people, is a particularly bad idea. But if you ask, is there a crisis? It seems unlikely. Just, you know, politically, I would love to say this is going to be a disaster, but I actually, when I tried to work through it, I've written about this a little bit. I can't convince myself that there's going to be much of a market reaction at all.
Huh. So you don't describe the run-up in stocks to this bill?
Oh, actually, no. Look, stocks are up around the world. They're up by about the same amount all around the world. You really can't tell. You know, if you didn't know that the U.S. numbers were the U.S. numbers and the European numbers were the European numbers and the Japanese, you wouldn't know which was which. So there's a global stock boom, which is not particular to Trump. If you think there's a Trump bump, then you have to say there's a Merkel bump and there's an Abe bump as well.
Right. How would you characterize economic performance right now? Is the economy good, and how much credit does President Trump deserve for how the economy is doing?
The economy's pretty good. In fact, I mean, you know, it looks like we're close to full employment, although we don't know why wages aren't rising more. I think Trump gets essentially zero. No, but no, even under. First of all, there have been no actual policies, right? There hasn't really been any policy change, and the convention usually when people try to assess the economic impact of administrations is to assume that the first year reflects the policies of the previous administration. So, no, there's nothing that is Trumpian about what's going on.
Is there any possibility of sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of economic improvement under Trump, which is to say, immediately after he was elected, there was a big improvement in consumer sentiment, all from Republicans, who thought that the economy was terrible, and then it turned around, and because Trump was going to be president, they thought things would be really good. Could that be manifesting as, you know, more consumption, more business investment, you know, just because people feel confident in Trump's performance, that could be something that itself causes the economy to improve? Well,
the thing is, the economy's been adding jobs at a steady rate for years now. Mm-hmm. You can't see, if anything, the rate of increase is leveling off. The curve is bending downwards. You can't see any Trump effect in there. And look, these issues of self-fulfilling confidence or loss of confidence, that's a big deal when the unemployment is 10%. Mm-hmm. Then the economy's performance is crucially dependent upon having enough spending out there. Where we are now, you know, consumers get a lot more confident, the economy starts to grow faster, the Fed will raise rates faster. So it's kind of, we're not in that kind of universe anymore. That's a 2010 story, not a 2017 story.
Let's talk a little bit about the Fed. You've expressed concern, am I correct in saying that you think Jay Powell is a good pick to run the Fed?
Yeah.
But you're concerned about some of the other choices that the president has made or might make about the Federal Reserve Board?
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at, I would have said there was no good reason not to keep Janet Yellen, but Jay Powell appears to be a reasonable guy, appears to be no significant policy error between him and the Yellen regime, which is fine. What I was afraid of was that given that Republicans have been insistently and defiantly wrong about everything monetary for the past 10 years, that they would make having been wrong about everything be the criterion for being the chairman of the Fed. Well, that didn't happen. So Trump picked Powell, who looks like has been okay. The first up on but the people who are now being floated for Fed board do seem to fit that criterion. So we have Marvin Goodfriend, who's a reputable monetary economist with a tremendous track record of saying inflation is coming, we must get ready to start raising rates now during 10 years of a depressed economy.
How much should we think of Fed policy as being driven by the on-the-record ideological statements of people who end up on the board? I mean, it seems like, first of all, the chairman ends up having a lot of influence, even though decisions are made by a vote of the board. And then also, it feels like there's a lot of reaction to political and economic events. Once you get on the board, it becomes a lot costlier to be wrong about monetary policy than when you're someone just observing the board.
That has historically been the case. It has historically been the case that the staff ends up, the staff plus the chairman ends up setting monetary policy, and that members of the board rarely will balk the will of the chairman on if it agrees with what the staff is saying. You can see that in both directions, by the way. Ben Bernanke was a much more aggressive monetary dove before he went to the Fed than he was afterwards. During the crisis, we kept on saying, if only Ben Bernanke would listen to Ben Bernanke. But once you get at the Fed, there's an environment, there's an acculturation. But this is Trump's America, so maybe the old rules don't apply anymore.
But Trump says he's a low interest rate guy.
Sometimes, but he's been all over the place on that. But the question is, to what extent are the Paul Ryan is an Ayn Rand monetary theorist who thinks that Atlas Shrugged contains the rules for monetary policy. So how much is we don't know what's going to happen.
Let's talk about trade. Do you worry at all about Trump's rhetoric on trade? What if he follows through on threats to withdraw from NAFTA or to start a trade war with China? What's the effect of that in the U.S.?
The NAFTA issue, I think, is it's a huge issue if it happens, which is probably why it probably won't happen. But the thing about NAFTA is not so much who are the beneficiaries. I think in fact the United States benefits from NAFTA. But the main point there is that there's no such thing now as Mexican manufacturing and U.S. manufacturing. There's North American manufacturing. It's this tightly integrated complex of industries where stuff is shipped back and forth. Different pieces of an automobile are made all over the continent. And if you break that up, if you disrupt it, then that's hugely, then we're talking about a lot of disruption at the industry level. We're talking about a lot of plants closing, maybe new plants opening, workers, it would be exactly the same sort of thing that people complained about from the growth of trade, except this time, it's like the old
one-time disruption would be substantial.
It's like the old joke about the motorist who runs over a pedestrian and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, let me fix it." So he backs up and he runs over the pedestrian again. And so that would be a hugely costly thing if we really disrupt NAFTA. That means that industry is horrified at the prospect. And now, so in a way, trade is going to be the test of whether there's any of that Trumpian or unorthodoxy left. Is he willing to balk the big companies on that?
Regardless of whether there's a good remedy available to Trump or whether the remedy that he's talking about makes any sense, is he right in his critique that free trade and relatively loose immigration policies have depressed the wages of native-born American workers over the last few decades?
Trade, a little bit. Most estimates do suggest that, a reasonable estimate suggests that if increased international trade did have some depressing effect on blue-collar wages in the United States. We import labor-intensive products that reduces the demand. It's probably not huge, and it's probably mostly in the past. It's not a continuing force of further downward pressure. Immigration, actually, the evidence suggests that immigrant workers are not, for the most part, competing with native-born workers. They're competing with immigrant workers who are already here more than that. Even though, you take somebody with 11 years of education from Mexico or Central America, compare them with somebody with 11 years of education born here, they're actually very different. The skill set's very different. The occupations are very different. So the immigration thing, although it's the one that resonated most with Trump voters, is probably, in fact, the place where his economics is just wrong. He has a better case on trade.
Finally, I want to ask you about Bitcoin. Does the run-up in Bitcoin prices make any sense to you?
No.
What's going on here?
Bitcoin, nobody understands it, which is, for the time being, a positive. It comes with
this positive for the prices?
For the price of it. It's got this mystique about it because there's some fancy technological thing that nobody really understands. There's been no demonstration yet that it actually is helpful in conducting economic transactions. There's no anchor for its value. Unlike pieces of paper with dead presidents on them, those are anchored by the fact that you can use them to pay taxes. There's no anchor for Bitcoin. But Bitcoin has developed this mystique. Partly the price is going up, partly it is tied up with libertarian stuff. I'm told that there are, apocalyptic, the end is coming guys who are accumulating Bitcoin because once we turn into a Mad Max wasteland, having a digitally distributed, never mind. So, I think it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the psychology of it is clearly. I mean, if you're using the the shoe shine boy test, or my barber asked me about Bitcoin, the feeling that people are caught up in something that they really don't understand is overwhelming.
So you think this is an obvious bubble?
It's the most, if this isn't this is even more obvious, I think, than the housing bubble was, and that one was, I thought, tremendously obvious.
So sometimes a bubble can be obvious and yet can persist for a long time.
Yeah.
And in fact, you can, I mean, I've been saying that Canadian housing is in a bubble for years and it keeps going up.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the nice thing about calling a bubble is that you can always, if it doesn't burst, you can always say, well, it's just going to burst later. But I guess the question is, how long can something like this go on with Bitcoin?
Well, the thing about Bitcoin is there isn't actually a whole lot of stuff. There's not, in a way, the fact that it's completely untethered to anything real means that it doesn't fall until it can just hang there in midair for a long, long time. There's no obvious real. It's not like housing prices. If housing prices are unrealistic, then more housing comes on, gets built, and you can see that Bitcoin. The cost of producing new Bitcoins has gone crazily high, so that's not going to happen. So we're waiting for a Wile E. Coyote moment. In the cartoon physics, he runs off the edge of a cliff, and it's only when he looks down and realizes there's nothing under him, then he goes. Phew. So we're waiting for that sort of thing to happen, and that can go on for a long time. A bubble is a natural Ponzi scheme. That's how Bob Shiller puts it. That it's as long as it's going on, everybody who bought in keeps making money, and it looks good. And the fact that in the end, somebody's going to be left holding the bag, everybody assumes it's not going to be them.